In this news roundup of the week for 28th of October 2022, US political support for Ukraine shows the first signs of fracturing as Vladimir Putin predicts the most dangerous decade. The UK has a new Prime Minister in Rishi Sunak who promises a return to competence in government. And the global climate summit COP27 is looming, which means a rash of updates about how we're not on target. And in this week's Short Thought, I reflect on how far adrift from reality some American views on the UK have become. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. President Putin continues his clear strategy, holding on to gains in Ukraine, keeping the conflict there alive, while time, and particularly for Europe, the coldness of winter, undermines the Western consensus. There were certainly some signs that might be beginning to work in the US this week, in the heat of battle for the midterm elections, and, before they all got distracted by Elon Musk finally taking control of Twitter, progressive Democrats published a letter that called on the White House to negotiate with Putin. The letter carried the signatures of 30 progressives, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and it was originally signed back in June. Following an immediate backlash, the head of the Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, withdrew it, saying it was drafted months ago, it was released by staff without vetting. A number of the signatories said that they'd changed their position since signing it. Now, this came just a few days after, on the other side of the aisle, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy said that Kyiv could not expect a blank cheque if the GOP wins support of the House in the coming election. That doesn't necessarily indicate a softening of support in practice. It may simply be a nod to those concerned that support is in line with realistic objectives, because nobody gets a blank cheque, let's face it. But others have pointed out that the Democrat progressives line is similar to that expressed recently by Donald Trump, who in a social media post said, "Get a negotiated deal done now. Both sides need and want it." Not actually true. Ukraine does not want a negotiated deal, since that would imply ceding territory to Russia. But should Republicans win back the House and possibly the Senate as well, Trump's voice will at least be an influential one. For now, the $18 billion pipeline of US military aid seems secure. Putin will be wondering for how much longer. Since the critics on both sides of the aisle mentioned the threat of nuclear war as one of their chief motivations for a deal, they have effectively incentivised Putin to ramp up those threats and to hold on. So no surprise that Putin was this week conducting nuclear war games, simulating exactly the sort of massive strike that his opponents fear. Drills with nuclear forces do take place every year to confirm and demonstrate their readiness for action, but the timing of this round was, shall we say, convenient. So far, Biden has been clear that there is no question of the United States negotiating with Russia over the heads of the Ukrainians about what happens in their country. But with some on both sides calling for exactly that, it's not clear whether Ukraine can rely on the US to hold that position for an extended period. This week we certainly saw Putin encouraging that view in comments where he suggested that Ukraine had lost sovereignty, was being used by the US as a battering ram against Russia. Russian State Duma Speaker Vyacheslav Volodin added to that particular campaign message saying this: Ukraine has lost the ability to exist as a state. Ukraine is occupied by NATO, and Ukraine has become a colony of the US. The language suggests that the Kremlin still seeks a military victory in Ukraine, including a change of regime in Kyiv. A view that was then reinforced when Putin made what was flagged in advance as a major foreign policy speech, which turned out to be broadly a restatement of his previously announced positions and criticisms of the West. The headlines focused on him saying that the world faced its most dangerous decade since the end of World War II. Really, he was making an argument to the independent nations of the world to try to rally them to join Russia in its stand against the arrogant West, which was seeking to impose its values on the world, he said. It was a speech that included some actually powerful points about the growing intolerance of certain elites with any values but their own. Points that were entirely undermined by the context in which the speech was being given. and the rather ironic plea for sovereign nations to be respected. You have to understand that Putin sees sovereignty as something that is won through strength, not something that exists as an automatic part of statehood. So in his mind, Russia equals sovereign nation. Ukraine, well, that's Russia's backyard, which is all very convenient for him. On the ground, Russia has been seeking to evacuate civilians in Kherson, claiming that it has moved over 70,000 people from the south of the province. Now, in international law, an occupying power can temporarily evacuate civilians for their safety. Permanent resettlement programs would be a different story. There is some suggestion, though, that the real motivation for at least some of the moves is that Russia, having initially suggested it would be retreating from Kherson, is in fact setting up for urban warfare in the city, and is digging in for what's described as the heaviest of battles. Previous experience showed the Russians that Ukrainians living in such areas would often find ways to get intelligence to Ukrainian troops as to where the Russian forces were based. So clearing them out of the area is as much about avoiding that from happening as it is about anything else. It seems that the situation on the ground is going to be pretty intense over the coming weeks. Elsewhere, we're seeing, if not politics as normal, then at least politics as sort of normal. In the UK, the joke goes, you can see the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace every day, and the changing of Prime Minister at number 10 Downing Street most afternoons. After a rollercoaster few days, Boris Johnson was finally dissuaded from pushing his claim. The third candidate, Penny Mordaunt, failed to reach the high bar of 100 nominating MPs, and so the crown went to Rishi Sunak. Sunak brings credibility with the markets, having been a Chancellor of the Exchequer with some distinction, having predicted the negative consequences of Liz Truss's planned growth programme. Indeed, the fall in gilt yields and the rise in the pound reflected an initial sense that Britain was regaining some degree of credibility, to be confirmed when policy details have actually been announced. Boris Johnson's exit from the race was as abrupt as his entry had been. According to former Tory leader Ian Duncan Smith, Johnson had flown back from his holiday, expecting that at least 150 MPs would quickly back him in his bid to return to the top slot. In the event, that was not what he found. Duncan Smith said that Johnson had been left begging for votes over the weekend in a demeaning effort to get support. But a good number of MPs who supported him first time round realised it would be a very different proposition this time. It became reasonably obvious that the push for unity was going to dominate when right-leaning Tories, who would normally have not been supporters of Rishi Sunak, such as Brexit champion Steve Baker, former candidates Kemi Badenoch and Suella Braverman, and former Brexit Minister Lord Frost, all declared for him. They were simply recognising what was relatively obvious to anyone who wasn't deeply bunkered in, which is that the Conservatives would be almost ungovernable for anybody, but it would dissolve into civil war if Boris Johnson had been voted leader again at this point in their history. It seems that the party's survival instincts are still strong enough that a number of key figures who were not Sunak fans came to the conclusion that it's, as Sunak himself put it, unite or die. Can they maintain that unity for the next 2 years? Seems unlikely based on all the background discussion that comes to light. Bearing in mind, not everything that makes it into the media is based on fact rather than spin. Sunak is basing his pitch to the party as being the one to give it the best shot, whereas Truss appointed her ministers almost exclusively on who were her supporters. Sunak is seeking the most capable operators and seeking to balance his cabinet with different opinions and traditions. That is considered to be the right thing to do. It is indeed what Margaret Thatcher herself did when she was elected, only choosing after a couple of years to purge her most determined opponents when she felt she was in a strong enough position to do it. Now that moment could come for Sunak, but probably only if he can pull off what would be a truly miraculous, by any measure, win in the next general election. Short of that, he's going to have a difficult balancing act. But he is doing what is held to be the right thing, so if it turns out the Conservative Party really is ungovernable, it won't simply be a reaction to ham-fisted mistakes as we saw constantly from his recent predecessors. For us floating voters who would like our government to do well for the sake of the country, I imagine I'm not alone in thinking that a period where politics became boring on the domestic front would be no bad thing, at least for a while. I don't mind the fact that the government will be, in the short term, and to be fair, against its preferences, putting up taxes if I believe the people in charge are actually competent. Because look, whether it was the right policy at the time or not, the UK borrowed £325 billion for COVID, somewhere between 60 to 100 billion extra for energy price support. The UK debt at £2.4 trillion is around 100% of GDP and the highest it's been for 60 years. Now, it's not catastrophic. There's a number of other countries with higher debt to GDP ratios. But at a time when defence spending will have to be higher, when we'll continue to see some of the consequences of the last couple of years in various ways, no government is going to have licence to do much of the crowd-pleasing stuff that they like to promise in their manifestos. These are not the only issues that people are focused on, of course. So it seems like only yesterday that the COP26 climate conference took place in Glasgow. At least if you forget the fact that Britain has gone through 2 prime ministers since then. In any case, the new COP27 summit in Egypt is nearly upon us. At the time of shooting this video, the new UK Prime Minister, who has reiterated his support for the Net Zero project, has nevertheless said he will not be attending the summit in person. It's not entirely surprising. The autumn budget statement, upon which rather a lot is riding, falls right in the middle of that period. Needless to say, the opposition and environmentalists jumped on this as a terrible derogation of duty. He did win some kudos the day before by announcing the reimposition of the ban on fracking, which was released for a couple of glorious weeks by his immediate predecessor. It's more of a symbolic value than anything else, given the various indicators that suggested it wouldn't make that much contribution to the UK's energy supply anyway, but it was a box nicely ticked as far as some were concerned. Whatever else the COP27 summit means, it does mean that a number of reports and inputs get released in the immediate run-up. So this week, the United Nations released an analysis of the actions taken by government so far following the last conference, and it found that the world is on track for 2.5 degrees C warming by the end of the century. It's actually a range between 2.1 and 2.9, with 2.5 the best estimate. The review was based on the combined pledges of 193 countries. It noted that just 24 have submitted new or revised targets in advance of this coming summit. Now, as you'd expect, the United Nations argued that much more needs to be done if there's to be any hope of keeping to the 1.5 degrees target from the Paris Agreement. The World Meteorological Organization also published its annual report, saying that the world saw new highs in concentrations of greenhouse gases, particularly because of a record increase in methane. That was for 2021. Probably not helped since then by the Nord Stream pipelines releasing significant quantities of their contents into the atmosphere. The cause of the methane increase in 2021, though, is not clear. It's thought to be from both biological and human-induced processes. The growth in levels of carbon dioxide also continued to increase, mostly due to fossil fuels and cement production. A confirmation that as the economies of the world have been rebounding post-pandemic, so too have emissions. Separately, the International Energy Agency produced its annual World Energy Outlook report, which suggested that Russia's action against Ukraine and its use of energy as a weapon against Europe will accelerate the peaking of the world's consumption of fossil fuels as countries switch to renewables and nuclear more quickly. Gas demand, it says, is now expected to join oil and coal in peaking near the end of this decade, somewhat sooner than expected. That hasn't stopped, of course, oil and gas companies from recording record profits this year thanks to the higher prices of the last 6 months. What's interesting, but rather less commented upon, are the reflections on the geopolitical consequences of how policy changes are likely to play out. So, for example, net zero restrictions on new oil drilling will have the, shall we say, mixed benefit, at best, of strengthening Saudi Arabia's grip on the global market. It's an indicator of how unintended consequences would abound if a way to deal with declining use of fossil fuels was simply to halt any new extraction and freeze all of the current access points where they are. The current energy crisis has shown how much it can jump back on you if you reduce the supply of something before you've successfully reduced the demand. No signs we're anywhere near a grown-up conversation of what that might mean in practice. And I don't imagine that's going to happen at COP27 either. I could be wrong. Last week, I talked about the general principle that if you don't see the world clearly, you will fail in any attempts to change it or even possibly to survive it. And I pinned the inability to see the world clearly on the influence of ideology, which seeks to mould evidence to fit its preconceptions, not to create a view of the world based on the evidence. And that works for ideologies of all political flavours. But this week, let's focus briefly on that of the American left. Trevor Noah, the soon-to-be ex-host of The Daily Show, had a segment on his programme about Britain's new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. Or more specifically, he talked about what he said was a large-scale racist backlash against him as Britain's first non-white Prime Minister. He went on to wax lyrical about the suppression of black people and women in powerful positions, and he said, "You hear a lot of people saying, oh, they're taking over. Indians are going to take over Great Britain, and what's next?" He then suggested that large numbers of people in the UK are just like Tucker Carlson. You see people in the UK, you see people like Tucker Carlson all the time saying, you know what they're trying to do, they won't stop until black people and women are in positions of power. So what, he said. And he said that seeing the backlash was one of the more telling things about how people view the role that they or their people have played in history. Now, the fact that Noah sees a backlash is certainly telling, but more about how he and his fellow ideologues see the world than about anything that's actually happening in it. Because there has been no backlash against Rishi Sunak based on his race. The fact that Noah could point to one random caller to a talk show who said a thing, that's what he had to point at, kind of goes to prove the point. The obsession with race by the American left creates its own reality, and it's one very much at odds with what they say they want. So in the UK, like everywhere else, we have a mixed bag of politicians. Promoting people on merit gets confused with promoting them on ideology just as much as anywhere else. So we get some good, we get some bad, but we don't promote them on the basis of their sex or their skin colour. And yet we've had 3 women prime ministers and now one of Asian heritage. Not the first ethnic minority, by the way. That would have been the Jewish Benjamin Disraeli back in 1874. And when the last woman prime minister turned out to be terrible, nobody said that that criticism of her was based on sexism, because it wasn't. Maybe some of the criticism Margaret Thatcher got in her earliest years, maybe that was based on sexism, but that was back in the 1980s. And it certainly wasn't based on that by the end. When you don't obsess about these things, you could focus on what people do and, on the content of their character. By contrast, the US has had no women presidents, has had one black president who was elected on merit, not on the basis of his skin colour. But rather than learning the lesson of that, they now detail in advance what will be the sex and skin colour of appointments to high office, such as the Vice President of the United States. And then if some of them turn out to be terrible, because you're not appointing on merit, that sends out kind of the exact opposite signal to the one that you wanted to be sending. Now, look, you can debate all that. There are arguments for taking that approach. I happen to think they're not supported by real-world evidence, but maybe I'm wrong. But if you look to the UK and so thoroughly misunderstand what's actually happening here, it does suggest that your perception of the world is so distorted by your own perspective that your judgment as to what works and what doesn't is likely to be seriously impaired. Now, occasionally we get to see so because someone says it in full view of the world, as Noah just did. More often, these misperceptions get fed into decisions. We can only guess at what the misjudgments were when the consequences of those decisions go horribly wrong. One reason why I favour pragmatism over ideology in most circumstances. Alright, the plan was to release 2 videos this week, but a rush on client work and certain other things going on in life just made that impossible. There is a nearly edited video that will be released soon on the crucially important difference between China and Russia. It's a symptom of the stalled growth of this channel because the YouTube algorithm still doesn't really know what to do with this content. The fact that I can put the time into making the videos at all comes down to the support that I get from Patreon supporters. If people think that an independent, fact-focused and non-ideological voice is worth supporting, then maybe it can survive even YouTube's indifference. If you would like to add your strength to that measure, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.